It started subtly. The HOA had always been a thorn in the side, but nothing prepared me for this. Day after day, I noticed tire tracks forming faint lines across my freshly mowed lawn. At first, I assumed it was maintenance, some contractor taking a shortcut, but the pattern quickly became unmistakable. Someone was deliberately cutting across my property. And it wasn't accidental. It was habitual. I tried talking to the HOA first. A polite email, a few friendly phone calls, even a brief conversation during a neighborhood meeting. Each time, the answer was the same: vague apologies, empty promises, and then the behavior continued. The audacity was staggering. Their authority had limits, and yet they acted as if property lines didn't apply to them. That's when Karen appeared. The board member everyone feared, loud, entitled, convinced she could bend rules to her will. She would walk right across my lawn during inspections, leaning over my garden beds, as if she owned every blade of grass. Every time, I bit my tongue. Patience, I reminded myself, was part of the plan. Reacting emotionally would only give her leverage. I started documenting everything. Photos of tire tracks, timestamps on phone records, even video footage from my security cameras. Every incident, every step across my lawn, was recorded meticulously. I knew that if this escalated legally or publicly, I needed undeniable evidence. Meanwhile, the tracks didn't stop. One day, Karen arrived in a golf cart with two other HOA members. They sped across the grass like it was a public road, leaving ruts and flattened flowers. I watched quietly from the porch, letting frustration simmer beneath the surface. The neighborhood noticed too, but no one dared confront her directly. The HOA's aura of authority had kept everyone compliant for years. But authority without legitimacy can't last forever. That realization gave me clarity. I didn't need to escalate through confrontation. I needed a solution that would speak louder than words, louder than rules, louder than Karen herself. Something that would make the behavior impossible to repeat. Something permanent. Planning the surprise became an obsession. It had to be dramatic but legal, clever but undeniable. I wanted Karen to understand, without a word, that the lawn was mine and mine alone. For weeks, I schemed quietly, measuring distances, imagining her daily paths, considering angles, and visualizing the moment of revelation. Neighbors began to notice subtle changes. Trucks delivering materials for something big. Sections of the lawn temporarily cordoned off. Curiosity bubbled, but questions went unanswered. Everyone assumed it was standard landscaping or a minor home project. Only I knew the real purpose. The day finally came. Karen showed up with her usual swagger, clipboard in hand, ready to assert her imaginary rights. I stayed back, camera rolling, letting her proceed as she always had. And then it happened. The surprise was revealed. A clever installation that completely blocked the path she had taken for months, a visual and physical reminder that my property could not be crossed at will. Her reaction was immediate. Shock, disbelief, and finally, a loud scream of frustration. She stepped back, scanning the obstacle, realizing that no amount of authority or intimidation could undo it. The HOA could no longer claim control over my land. Every trespasser from that moment forward would face the same obstacle. The neighborhood witnessed it all. Some laughed, some cheered, and others simply shook their heads. What had been a repeated violation of property lines was now impossible to ignore. Karen had assumed entitlement. She had learned restraint. The surprise wasn't just physical, it was a statement, a legal and psychological barrier wrapped in one. And in that moment, I realized patience, planning, and strategy always outweigh raw arrogance. Authority without ownership is meaningless. And a well-executed surprise can teach even the boldest HOA Karen exactly where the line is. The day after the surprise installation, the neighborhood was buzzing. Karen didn't approach me personally, but her reaction had been enough to spread a wave of curiosity and gossip. Neighbors whispered over fences, comparing notes about her frantic pacing and repeated attempts to figure out what had blocked the familiar shortcut. Some of them admitted privately that they had always found her audacity intimidating, but now, Watching her stumble, they felt a rare sense of justice. The HOA, of course, did not take this quietly. Emails flooded my inbox within hours. Threats, demands, and vague references to community guidelines arrived from board members who clearly had no clue how to address the situation. Karen's signature on each notice carried the same aggressive tone she had displayed in person, but now there was an unmistakable edge of desperation. Her attempts to reclaim authority were faltering. The first escalation came as a letter suggesting that the installation interfered with HOA access and violated unspecified bylaws. It was carefully worded, but its intent was transparent: intimidate me into removing the obstacle. I responded calmly, sending photos, measurements, and a clear note stating that the installation was entirely within my property boundaries. I even included county parcel maps showing that the path Karen had been using wasn't part of any easement or HOA right-of-way. Within hours, Karen escalated to another tactic, the classic call the authorities. A police officer arrived at my property, clipboard in hand, seemingly summoned by a complaint from the HOA. I explained the situation politely, presented the documented property lines, and handed over proof of the installation's legality. The officer nodded, made a note, and left. Karen's bluff had failed. Once again, documentation outweighed intimidation. Meanwhile, the neighborhood's perception of events shifted dramatically. Neighbors who had once silently observed Karen's antics now approached me, asking questions about property boundaries, ownership, and legal rights. Their fear of confrontation faded as they saw the surprise installation hold firm and the HOA's repeated threats fail. Some even expressed admiration for the planning, strategy, and patience it took to create an obstacle that could not be ignored or removed without permission. The HOA board tried another approach: communication through passive-aggressive notices and veiled warnings. They suggested that repeated obstacles could constitute a safety hazard or community disturbance, hinting at potential fines or litigation. But these messages lacked any legal footing. I had spent weeks preparing, documenting, and confirming that everything was within my rights. Their words were now empty, noise without substance. Karen, unable to regain control, began showing visible signs of panic. She patrolled less frequently, no longer striding across the lawn with confidence. Her attempts to strategize with other board members seemed frantic, disorganized, and increasingly public. Even casual neighbors could see her demeanor shifting, from confident authority to flustered, uncertain, and defensive. The power dynamic was reversing. For years, the HOA had relied on assumption, fear, and routine to maintain control. Now, those assumptions were being questioned openly. Even residents who had previously aligned with Karen's enforcement started to recognize that authority does not override legality. The surprise installation had done more than block a path. It had exposed weakness, forced accountability, and shifted the balance of power. By the end of the week, Karen's attempts to intimidate or reclaim control had ceased entirely. The installation remained, pristine and unchallenged, a constant visual reminder of boundaries, legality, and the consequences of overreach. Residents walked past it daily, often smiling, sometimes chuckling quietly at the audacity it represented. The lesson was clear: persistence and patience, combined with meticulous planning, could turn the tables on even the boldest HOA overreach. Karen had assumed authority without legitimacy, and the surprise installation demonstrated, vividly and permanently, that power without legal foundation is nothing more than noise. Karen's frustration became increasingly visible in public. She could no longer walk across the lawn with confidence, and every attempt to regain composure ended in hesitation or abrupt retreats. The HOA, sensing the faltering, tried to reassert authority through letters and passive-aggressive notices, but it was clear to everyone that their words carried no weight. Neighbors whispered among themselves, comparing experiences, sharing the photos and videos of the installation that blocked her path. The surprise had done more than physically obstruct the route. It had exposed her overreach and the board's inability to enforce authority where it didn't exist. A week after the initial incident, A second escalation arrived in the form of a formal notice threatening legal action. It claimed that my installation could interfere with community safety and violate HOA standards. The letter was carefully drafted, but it lacked any legal backing. I responded methodically, attaching documentation, property maps, deed records, measurements, and photographs proving that the obstacle was entirely within my property lines. I included a polite but firm note stating that any attempt to remove or damage the installation would constitute trespassing. The HOA's response was almost immediate and almost comedic in its desperation. Karen personally attempted to confront me on my lawn again, clipboard in hand, accompanied by 2 board members. Her tone was sharp, her voice raised, but the confidence that had once made her intimidating was gone. She gestured toward the installation as if sheer will could dissolve it, and when that failed, she attempted to explain community rules that applied nowhere legally. I remained calm, letting her words hang in the air while neighbors observed quietly from their windows and porches. By now, the neighborhood was fully aware of the situation. Conversations about property boundaries, HOA overreach, and legality became common in front yards and driveways. Some neighbors admitted privately that they had feared Karen's authority for years. Now, seeing her frustration and the legality of the obstacle, those fears began to fade. People started asking me questions about how they could protect their own property from similar overreach. The surprise installation had become both a deterrent and a lesson for the entire block. Meanwhile, the HOA attempted a third escalation, calling local authorities. Karen filed a complaint suggesting that the installation was a hazard and needed immediate attention. A police officer arrived, clipboard in hand, to assess the situation. I presented documentation again: deeds, maps, measurements, and photographs. The officer reviewed the evidence, acknowledged the legality of the installation, and left. Karen's bluff had failed once more. Authority without legal backing, she learned, meant nothing. Tension among the HOA board members intensified. Behind closed doors, they argued about how to respond next. Some suggested disengaging entirely, fearing personal liability. Others, led by Karen, insisted on more aggressive measures. But the neighborhood had already seen the weakness. The HOA could no longer act without scrutiny. Every attempt to enforce rules was now met with questions, documentation requests, and scrutiny from residents who no longer assumed authority automatically. As days passed, Karen's energy and influence waned further. She attempted one more minor patrol, inspecting my lawn from a distance, but the surprise installation remained untouched. Residents passing by exchanged glances and smiles. The physical barrier had done its work. It wasn't just a deterrent, it was a permanent reminder that entitlement and assumed authority have limits. By the end of the week, the HOA had retreated to emails, passive warnings, and vague notices. Karen's presence on the block diminished almost entirely. The surprise installation stood as a constant visual lesson. When power is assumed without legitimacy, it can be challenged and sometimes cleverly and permanently stopped. The message was clear: strategy, preparation, and patience always outweigh raw aggression. Karen had assumed control through intimidation, but the installation had proved that authority without legal grounding is nothing. Residents and I had witnessed the collapse of perceived power, and the block itself began to regain calm. After the failed attempts to intimidate me and remove the installation, the HOA quietly began to retreat. The letters stopped arriving almost entirely, and emails became sporadic and cautious. Karen, who had once roamed the neighborhood with unchecked authority, was now almost invisible. The block, once tense with fear of HOA reprisal, started to feel normal again. Residents could walk freely, children played on lawns without worrying about inspections, and homeowners no longer whispered warnings to each other about imaginary fines or violations. The shift was subtle, yet profound. Behind the scenes, the board was in disarray. Meetings were held with fewer attendees, and those who once supported Karen's aggressive tactics now advocated for disengagement. Some board members admitted privately that their previous enforcement strategies had been overzealous, motivated more by fear of confrontation than by legal obligation. Karen, however, remained defiant. She drafted a few emails asserting community standards, but these were met with polite but firm rebuttals referencing legal boundaries and property ownership. Each response she received only highlighted the futility of her position. For Karen, the psychological blow was significant. She had built her authority on intimidation, assuming compliance without question. When faced with a permanent, legal barrier she could not bypass, her influence crumbled. Every attempt to regain control met resistance, every argument was countered with documentation, and every threat evaporated under scrutiny. Even neighbors who had previously been loyal to the HOA began openly questioning her approach, sharing experiences of minor punishments, fines, and arbitrary inspections. I took steps to ensure that the resolution was not temporary. The installation, now fully integrated into the landscape, was a permanent structure, clearly marking my property and preventing further trespass. Boundary markers and signs clarified the limits of my property. Communication channels were opened with neighbors for questions or concerns, not to enforce arbitrary rules, but to foster clarity and understanding. Transparency replaced intimidation. Residents responded positively, appreciating the clarity and fairness of the new arrangement. Karen's final public attempt to assert authority came during a neighborhood meeting. She spoke loudly, pointing at the installation, claiming it was disruptive and unnecessary. Her tone was combative, but the impact was minimal. Residents had seen enough. They asked questions calmly, challenged her assumptions politely, and referenced legal documentation, showing the legitimacy of the installation. Karen faltered, unable to defend her position, and left the meeting in frustration. The room, once quiet in fear, now buzzed with conversations about boundaries, respect, and ownership. With Karen sidelined, the HOA began to function in a limited and procedural capacity. Meetings were rare and formal, communications strictly informational, and enforcement restricted to areas where authority was legally justified. The dramatic, personal power that had once made the HOA a source of stress for residents was gone. Neighborhood cooperation replaced fear, and the energy that had previously been dominated by Karen's confrontations shifted toward practical problem-solving. The lessons were clear and enduring. Authority must be grounded in legitimacy, not assumption. Overreach invites scrutiny and resistance. Strategic planning, documentation, and a calm, legal approach can neutralize even the most aggressive attempts to impose control. Residents now understood their rights, boundaries were respected, and the block had reclaimed a sense of calm it had not known in years. The HOA, for all intents and purposes, had been humbled. Karen, once the loudest enforcer, had lost both influence and credibility. Her legacy on the block became a cautionary tale. Power without legitimacy is fleeting, and intimidation cannot withstand strategy backed by law. The aftermath of the installation was quieter than I expected, but more powerful. The block, once tense and cautious under HOA surveillance, began to regain its natural rhythm. People walked freely across sidewalks, kids played on lawns without fear of reprimand, and casual conversations no longer revolved around rules or inspections. The HOA, stripped of its personal authority, became largely irrelevant. It still existed on paper, but its influence on everyday life had vanished. Residents began to realize that compliance had never been about fairness, it had been about fear. For Karen, the loss was undeniable. She no longer patrolled the block with the same confidence, nor did she issue commands with authority. Every attempt to reclaim influence ended in futility. Her presence, once a source of intimidation, had transformed into a symbol of overreach and failure. Residents no longer responded to her threats, and her arguments were met with polite but firm references to law and ownership. The surprise installation, combined with clear documentation, had permanently shifted the balance of power. Neighbors began approaching me, not out of fear, but curiosity and relief. Questions arose. How did you know it would work? Could we do something similar for our property? What's the best way to protect ourselves from the HOA in the future? The answers were simple: patience, planning, and legality. The strategy had been deliberate, designed not to provoke unnecessary conflict, but to create a permanent and unmistakable boundary. It was a lesson in asserting rights without aggression, and it resonated with everyone watching. The HOA attempted to adapt, offering voluntary participation in minor projects and reducing enforcement attempts in areas where they had no legal authority. Residents responded politely but cautiously, recognizing that voluntary compliance is still optional. The board's procedural functions continued in technical terms, but without Karen's intimidation, the organization lacked the psychological power it had once wielded. It became clear to everyone that authority is only effective when it is respected and legitimate. Looking back, the most important moment wasn't the installation itself, nor the initial confrontation. It was the moment Karen realized that she had no legal recourse and that the HOA's assumed power was meaningless. That realization rippled through the neighborhood, changing perceptions and dynamics almost overnight. Authority, when disconnected from legitimacy, collapses under its own weight, no matter how loud or aggressive the enforcer may be. The installation itself became a symbol. It was not just a barrier to a lawn, but a reminder that preparation, planning, and clarity always outperform brute force and intimidation. Neighbors who had once feared HOA fines or inspections now understood their rights. The block shifted from a community ruled by fear to one guided by respect for property, boundaries, and lawful authority. Cooperation replaced intimidation, and the energy that had previously been consumed by conflict was redirected toward practical, community-focused solutions. For me, the lesson was simple. Patience and strategy, backed by legality, are far more effective than confrontation or anger. Leaving the HOA and asserting ownership wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming control over my property and establishing clear boundaries. The HOA's failure was inevitable the moment they overstepped, and the surprise installation merely made the lesson unavoidable. The block is now peaceful, orderly, and free from the arbitrary rules that had once dominated daily life. The HOA continues to exist, but as a procedural entity, without real authority. Karen's presence is minimal, her power gone, and her legacy serves as a cautionary tale for anyone who assumes control without legitimacy. In the end, the story is clear. Authority without law is powerless. Intimidation cannot withstand strategy, and a well-planned surprise can teach even the boldest HOA Karen exactly where the line is. Ownership, preparation, and patience are the real tools of control, and they last far longer than fear ever could.